The Galactic Peace Summit was supposed to be boring. That was the whole point. Neutral station, neutral ground, neutral everything. Even the air recycling system was diplomatically bland. Rebecca Martinez had been explaining human agricultural exports for 3 hours when Ambassador Klextar decided to get handsy. "Your species fascinates me." The 7-foot Zephyrian purred, his chitinous fingers wrapping around Rebecca's forearm like a vice. So soft, so vulnerable. David looked up from his datapad. His expression didn't change. That should have been the first warning. "Ambassador," Rebecca said carefully, "personal contact isn't part of our negotiation protocol." Klextar's mandibles clicked in what passed for Zephyrian laughter. "Relax, little human. I'm simply appreciating your delicate construction." The second warning was the way David set down his stylus. Precisely. Quietly. Like someone placing a weapon on a table. "Let go of her," David said. His voice was conversational. Pleasant even. The kind of tone you'd use to ask someone to pass the salt. Klextar's compound eyes swiveled toward David with amusement. "Or what? Soft skin? You'll file a complaint?" That's when David stood up. The Zephyrian ambassador was a foot taller and outweighed David by at least 50 pounds of armored chitin. He had natural weapons, military training, and the backing of a warrior species that had conquered 12 systems. None of that mattered. David moved like liquid violence. One moment he was sitting. The next his hand was wrapped around Klextar's wrist with enough force to make the alien's exoskeleton creak. "I said let go." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Rebecca had seen David upset before, but this was different. This was primal, ancient, the kind of response that had kept humans alive long enough to crawl out of caves and reach the stars. Klextar released her arm. David didn't release Klextar's wrist. "Security to conference room 12, the station AI announced cheerfully. "Minor altercation in progress. Response time, 37 seconds. "David," Rebecca said softly. "It's okay. I'm fine." He looked at her then, and for a moment, the predator mask slipped. "Did he hurt you?" "No, just startled me." The mask slid back into place as David turned to Klextar. "Apologize. I will not be dictated to by—" The sound Klextar's wrist made was wet and crunchy, like stepping on bubble wrap filled with jelly. The ambassador screamed. 6 security guards burst through the door, weapons drawn. They were Corvin military police, professional, well-trained, experienced in handling diplomatic incidents. They took one look at David and hesitated. That hesitation cost them everything. The first guard moved to flank David's left side. Standard procedure. Textbook execution. He even announced his intentions properly. "Sir, please step away from the ambassador and—" David spun, grabbed the guard's shock, baton mid-swing, and drove it into the alien's solar plexus hard enough to lift him off his feet. The guard hit the wall with a sound like a bag of wet cement. "Oh," said the second guard. "Yeah," David agreed, and broke his nose. The third and fourth guards tried to rush him simultaneously. David caught the first one's weapon arm, used the momentum to swing him into his partner, and both aliens went down in a tangle of limbs and regret. Guard number 5 had the bright idea to use his ranged weapon. He drew his sidearm with practiced efficiency, aimed center mass, and pulled the trigger. David wasn't there anymore. The stun bolt hit the conference table, which exploded in a shower of sparks and diplomatic documents. David was behind Guard 5 now, one hand on the alien's weapon, the other around his throat. Rude, David observed, and demonstrated what happened when human grip strength met alien vertebrae. Guard 6 was backing toward the door, weapon raised but shaking. "Stay back. I'm authorized to use lethal force." "So am I," David said mildly. The guard's weapon clattered to the floor. He ran. David turned back to Ambassador Klextar, who was cradling his mangled wrist and making sounds like a broken air conditioner. "Now," David said, stepping over the unconscious guards, "about that apology." The station's emergency klaxon began wailing. Red lights bathed the conference room in hellish crimson. The AI's voice echoed through the corridors. "Security breach in conference room 12. All available personnel respond immediately. This is not a drill." Rebecca sighed. "David, honey, I think you might have overreacted." David looked around at the carnage. 6 unconscious guards, 1 whimpering ambassador, and a conference room that looked like a hurricane had passed through it. "Maybe a little," he admitted. That's when the reinforcements arrived. 12 more guards flooded through the doorway. These weren't station security. They were Corvin Special Forces, called in when regular protocols failed spectacularly. They had better armor, better weapons, and better training. They also had the confidence that came from never having lost a fight. "Surrender now," their commander barked, "and we'll make this quick." David tilted his head like he was considering it. "Counteroffer." He caught the first stun bolt out of the air. Not deflected, not dodged, caught, with his bare hand. The bolt crackled between his fingers like trapped lightning. The guard stared. Physics wasn't supposed to work that way. "Thanks," David said, and threw it back. The commander's armor absorbed most of the impact, but the force still launched him backward into his squad. 3 guards went down like bowling pins. The remaining 9 opened fire simultaneously. David moved like he was dancing to music only he could hear. Bolts sizzled past his head, scorched the walls, set fire to what remained of the conference table. None of them touched him. He reached the nearest guard, took his weapon away, along with the arm holding it, and used both as improvised clubs. "This is insane," one guard whispered. "This is Tuesday," Rebecca corrected, stepping carefully around the expanding circle of violence. The station commander's voice crackled over the intercom. "All units, we have a Code 47 situation in Conference Room 12. Repeat, Code 47. "What's a Code 47? Asked a guard who was still conscious. "Uncontainable human," Rebecca explained helpfully. David paused in his systematic dismantling of the security forces. "I'm very containable. I'm right here." A guard tried to tackle him from behind. David caught him by the ankle, spun him around twice, and released him through the reinforced viewport. The window held. The guard's dignity did not. "Sir," the station AI announced, "please be advised that aggressive behavior violates 17 different Galactic peace accords." "Note my objection in the official record," David replied, using a shock baton to demonstrate advanced percussion techniques on another guard's helmet. Ambassador Klextar had crawled behind an overturned chair, still clutching his ruined wrist. "Stop him! Sedate him! Do something!" The medical officer who'd been monitoring the situation from the doorway cleared his throat. "Sir, human physiology under stress renders most sedatives ineffective. Their adrenaline response is unprecedented." "What does that mean?" "It means," Rebecca said, stepping over an unconscious guard, "that you pissed off the wrong species." David had cornered the last 3 conscious guards in the far corner of the room. They huddled together like children hiding from a monster. "Please," one of them whimpered. "We have families." David's expression softened slightly. "I'm not going to kill you. I'm going to educate you." He grabbed the nearest guard by his equipment harness and lifted him off the ground with one hand. Lesson 1. Humans are protective of their mates. He set the guard down gently, then demonstrated the concept by putting his fist through the reinforced wall next to the alien's head. Lesson 2. We don't respond well to threats. The second guard fainted. Lesson 3, David continued, turning toward Ambassador Klextar's hiding spot. We have very good memories. The station commander's voice returned, higher pitched now. Emergency lockdown initiated. All blast doors sealing in 3, 2, 1. Massive steel barriers slammed down across every entrance and exit. The conference room was now a sealed box. "There," the commander announced with relief. "Contained." David walked to the nearest blast door. 6 inches of military-grade Durasteel designed to stop boarding parties and small explosions. He punched it. The door buckled. "Oh," said the commander. David punched it again. Metal screamed, rivets popped, emergency lights flickered. "That's not possible," someone whispered over the intercom. "Humans," Rebecca said with fond exasperation, "don't really believe in impossible." The blast door gave up and fell outward with a crash that shook the entire station. David stepped through the opening, brushing dust off his suit jacket. "Ambassador Klextar, we're not finished talking." The Zephyrian scrambled to his feet, mandibles clicking in terror. "Stay back, I have diplomatic immunity." "You had diplomatic immunity," David corrected, "right up until you put your hands on my wife." Klextar ran. David followed at a leisurely pace, like a man out for an evening stroll. Rebecca trailed behind, occasionally apologizing to terrified civilians who pressed themselves against the walls as they passed. "Sorry about the mess," she called to the station commander's office. "We'll pay for damages." The hunt had begun. The station's corridors had never been designed for this kind of chase. They were wide, well-lit, and equipped with multiple security checkpoints that were supposed to stop unauthorized movement between sectors. The designers had accounted for riots, boarding actions, even full-scale military assaults. They had not accounted for David. The first checkpoint tried to deploy its standard containment protocol. Energy barriers hummed to life across the corridor, creating an impenetrable wall of crackling force fields that could stop a charging rhinoceros. David walked through them like they were made of soap bubbles. The barriers flickered, sparked, and died with electronic whimpers. Behind him, the checkpoint's AI began running diagnostic routines, trying to understand what had just happened to its theoretically unbreachable defenses. "Attention all civilians," the station AI announced with the kind of forced calm that suggested someone was holding a gun to its processors. "Please remain in your quarters until the current situation is resolved. This is for your own safety and the safety of others." Ambassador Klextar had a significant head start and the advantage of knowing the station's layout from 3 previous diplomatic visits. He also had the motivation that came from genuine terror and the growing certainty that his diplomatic immunity wasn't worth the datapad it was stored on. What he didn't have was the ability to move through solid matter, which was becoming increasingly relevant as David demonstrated that human determination could apparently overcome minor obstacles like reinforced bulkheads. "This is impossible." Klextar panted into his communicator as he rounded another corner, his chitinous feet clicking frantically against the deck plating. "Humans aren't supposed to be this fast." "Sir," his aide's voice crackled back through the static-filled connection, "perhaps you should consider offering a formal apology. Our cultural databases suggest humans' value." "I am a Zephyrian ambassador," Klextar snarled, spittle flying from his mandibles. "I don't apologize to evolutionary accidents." Behind him, something went crash with the finality of a building falling down. Klextar risked a glance over his shoulder and immediately wished he hadn't. David was stepping through what had been a reinforced security door, the twisted remains of Durasteel framing hanging around him like metallic confetti. His business suit was still immaculate. His tie was still straight. He wasn't even breathing hard. "Evolutionary accidents," David repeated thoughtfully, his voice carrying clearly down the corridor despite the distance between them. "That's an interesting perspective from someone whose species peaked at scary bug with delusions of grandeur." Klextar's compound eyes went wide with panic. Humans weren't supposed to have that kind of hearing, or that kind of casual disregard for what constituted insulting diplomatic language. He ran faster. The corridor ahead split into 3 directions: left toward the residential quarters, right toward the industrial sections, and straight ahead toward the docking bays. Klextar chose straight ahead without hesitation. His ship was docked in Bay 94. If he could reach it, he could escape this nightmare and file a formal complaint with the Galactic Council. This would probably mean war between the Zephyrian Empire and humanity, but at least he'd be alive to see the opening salvos. The second security checkpoint was better prepared than the first. It had been monitoring the situation and had deployed its full arsenal of non-lethal suppression methods: stun fields, sonic disruptors, even a localized gravity manipulation field that should have been sufficient to stop a rampaging elephant. David walked through all of them without slowing down. The gravity field tried to crush him into the deck. He shrugged it off like it was a light breeze. The sonic disruptors tried to scramble his inner ear and nervous system. He ignored them completely. The stun fields attempted to overload his neural pathways with enough electricity to power a small city. David caught one of the stun bolts in his bare hand, examined it with mild curiosity, and flicked it back at the checkpoint's control panel. The entire security station exploded in a shower of sparks and the acrid smell of burning electronics. Rude, David observed, stepping over the smoldering wreckage. In the station's command center, Chief of Security Thex Maul was experiencing what humans would have called a nervous breakdown, and his own species termed acute reality displacement syndrome. "Sir," his aide reported, voice cracking with stress, "the human has breached checkpoint 7. Deploy the emergency barriers." "Already tried, sir. He walked through them." "The stun fields?" "Ineffective." "The gravity suppressors?" "He used one as a doorstop." Thexmol stared at the tactical display, watching the red dot representing David move steadily through the station's defenses like they were made of tissue paper and good intentions. "What about the blast doors?" "Sir, the blast doors are designed to contain hull breaches and explosive decompression. They're not really intended for..." "Deploy them, all of them. Seal every corridor between the human and the docking bays." "Sir, that will trap several hundred civilians in..." "Do it!" Massive steel barriers began slamming down throughout the station's corridors. Emergency klaxons wailed as sections sealed themselves off from each other. The blast doors were 6 inches of military-grade durasteel, rated to withstand direct hits from ship-mounted plasma cannons. David reached the first one and paused, studying it with the expression of a man considering a mildly interesting puzzle. He knocked politely. The door didn't answer. He knocked again, harder this time. The durasteel rang like a bell, and stress fractures appeared around the impact point. "That's not possible," someone whispered in the command center. David drew back his fist and hit the door with what appeared to be casual effort. The blast door exploded outward in a shower of twisted metal and shattered dreams. "Oh," said Chief Thexmol in a very small voice. David stepped through the smoking wreckage, brushing imaginary dust off his jacket sleeve. Behind him, emergency systems were frantically trying to seal the breach he'd just created, but their efforts seemed somehow half-hearted, as if the station's AI had given up and was just going through the motions. "Attention," the station AI announced, its voice now carrying a distinctly defeated tone. "Please be advised that the current security situation has exceeded all established parameters. We recommend prayer to whatever deities you find comforting." Ambassador Klextar could hear the sounds of systematic destruction echoing through the corridors behind him. Each crash, each scream of tortured metal, each electronic death cry of another security system marked David's steady approach with the inevitability of sunrise. The docking bay entrance was just ahead. Klextar's ship, the diplomatic vessel Crimson Mandible, was moored in Bay 94. The bay doors were sealed, but his diplomatic codes would override the locks. He could be in hyperspace within minutes. He burst through the entrance and immediately triggered the emergency lockdown. The door was designed to withstand hull breaches, explosive decompression, and the kind of industrial accidents that could turn a space station into an expanding cloud of debris. It lasted 37 seconds. The explosion that followed would later be described by station engineers as physically improbable and a violation of several conservation laws. The door didn't just break. It ceased to exist as a coherent structure, transformed into a cloud of metallic particles and the dreams of security designers everywhere. David stepped through the wreckage, still looking like he was heading to a shareholders' meeting. "Ambassador," he said politely, his voice carrying clearly across the vast docking bay. "I believe we were having a conversation. Klextar's ship was 100 meters away across the bay's deck. He could make it. His species was built for speed when necessary. He just had to..." "He didn't make it." David's hand closed around the back of Klextar's neck with the gentle precision of a mechanical press designed by someone who really understood the concept of measured force. The ambassador's feet left the deck. "Let me explain something about human anatomy," David said conversationally, his fingers finding the gaps between Klextar's chitinous plates with the kind of intimate knowledge that suggested he'd been studying Zephyrian physiology during his walk through the station. "We're not as fragile as your intelligence report suggested." He lifted the 7-foot alien off the ground with one hand, supporting Klextar's considerable weight as easily as he might hold a briefcase. "We're also not as civilized as our diplomatic credentials indicate." His grip shifted, fingers wrapping around the base of Klextar's spine with surgical precision. David's knowledge of alien anatomy was apparently more comprehensive than anyone had realized. "This," David explained, applying just enough pressure to make his point without causing permanent damage, "is your central nervous system, specifically the junction where your brainstem connects to your spinal column. Damage it, and you become a very large, very expensive paperweight." Klextar made a sound like steam escaping from a broken valve mixed with the dying wheeze of a deflating balloon. "The interesting thing about Zephyrian spinal architecture," David continued, his voice taking on the tone of a professor delivering a lecture to particularly slow students, "is how much pressure it can withstand before catastrophic failure occurs." He demonstrated by increasing his grip strength by approximately 3%. Klextar's scream echoed off the docking bay's metal walls, reverberating through the chamber with the kind of acoustic properties that suggested excellent engineering and poor soundproofing decisions. "Now," David said, his voice returning to its previous conversational tone, "about that apology you owe my wife." The docking bay's observation deck was crowded with station personnel, all staring in horrified fascination at the scene unfolding below. Chief Thexmol stood at the front, his face having progressed through several interesting colors before settling on a shade that his species associated with impending cardiac arrest. "Should we intervene?" asked his aide, though the question carried all the enthusiasm of someone volunteering for a suicide mission. "With what?" Thexmol replied, his voice cracking slightly. "We've deployed everything we have. Our best security forces are either unconscious, hiding in supply closets, or requesting immediate transfer to safer assignments like bomb disposal or wrestling space bears. What about calling for backup?" "From who? The Galactic Defense Force? They're 3 systems away, and by the time they arrive, this will either be resolved or we'll all be dead." "Possibly both." On the docking bay floor, David was providing what appeared to be an advanced seminar in applied xenobiology, using Klextar's spine as his primary teaching aid. The ambassador's responses had evolved from screaming to whimpering to a kind of rhythmic keening that suggested his vocal cords were approaching their operational limits. "I could try shooting him," suggested Lieutenant Kexvar, who had arrived with the station's heaviest plasma rifle and what remained of his professional optimism. "You're welcome to try," Thexmol said. "But our previous attempts at violence have been notably unsuccessful, and even if you manage to injure him, do you have any idea what the rest of his species would do to us? Humans have a documented history of disproportionate responses to threats against their own." Lieutenant Kexvar looked down at his weapon, then at David, then back at his weapon. He set it down carefully and took several steps away from it. "Point taken, sir." Rebecca appeared on the observation deck, slightly out of breath from keeping pace with David's leisurely rampage through the station's security infrastructure. Her briefcase was still perfectly organized, her diplomatic credentials were still valid, and her expression suggested someone who had dealt with this kind of situation before. "Excuse me," she said to Chief Thexmol. "Is there somewhere we could speak privately? I think we need to discuss some revisions to your diplomatic protocols." Below them, David was explaining the finer points of human protective instincts using Klextar's nervous system as a visual aid. The ambassador's responses had devolved into a series of clicks and whistles that the universal translator was struggling to process. "Yes," Thexmol said faintly. his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone whose worldview had just been systematically dismantled and rebuilt around the concept of human unpredictability. I think that would be very wise indeed. The emergency Galactic Council session was scheduled for 800 station time. By Euro 7:30, representatives from 43 species had gathered in the main conference chamber, their voices creating a cacophony of concern, outrage, and barely contained panic in 17 different languages. The chamber itself had been hastily modified overnight. Extra security barriers had been installed. Medical personnel were standing by. Several delegates had requested personal protection details, and at least 3 species had threatened to withdraw from the proceedings entirely if proper safety measures weren't implemented. At 8:35, 5 minutes after the session was supposed to begin, the chamber's main doors opened with a soft, pneumatic hiss. David walked in, still wearing his business suit from the previous day. It had somehow remained immaculate, despite his journey through half the station's security infrastructure. His tie was straight, his shoes were polished, and his expression was pleasantly professional. He was carrying Ambassador Klextar under one arm like a briefcase. The chamber fell silent with the kind of absolute quiet that usually preceded either enlightenment or apocalypse. "Good morning," David said pleasantly, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber's acoustic systems. "Apologies for the delay. The ambassador and I were having an extended discussion about proper diplomatic etiquette." He set Klextar down in the Zephyrian delegation's designated seating area with the careful precision of someone placing a fragile ornament on a high shelf. The ambassador slumped forward immediately, making soft whimpering sounds that the universal translator was gamely attempting to render as existential distress and regret. Councillor Vexnari of the Altarian Republic, serving as the session's moderator, cleared her throat with the kind of nervous precision that suggested she'd been practicing the gesture all morning. "Human, David," she began, consulting her notes with hands that trembled slightly. "We understand there was an incident yesterday evening involving yourself and Ambassador Klextar." "Incident is a rather dramatic term," David replied, straightening his cufflinks with casual precision. "I prefer to think of it as an educational opportunity, a cultural exchange, if you will. You destroyed 17 security checkpoints, caused 43 million credits in infrastructure damage, and put 37 security personnel in the medical bay," the Corvin delegate interjected, his voice carrying the strained tone of someone reading from a very long and very depressing list. "I improved the station's security protocols through practical testing," David corrected mildly. "Now everyone has a much better understanding of their actual effectiveness versus their theoretical specifications." Rebecca entered the chamber at that moment, her heels clicking against the polished floor with the confident rhythm of someone who had spent the morning preparing for exactly this kind of diplomatic crisis. Her briefcase was perfectly organized, her diplomatic credentials were in order, and her smile suggested someone who was about to make everyone's day significantly more complicated. "Shall we begin with the new protocols?" she asked, settling into her seat beside David and opening her briefcase with practiced efficiency. "What new protocols?" asked the Rigelian ambassador, though his tone suggested he already suspected he wasn't going to like the answer. "The human mate protection protocols," Rebecca announced, distributing data pads around the table with the kind of systematic efficiency that made bureaucrats everywhere weep with admiration. "Effective immediately. Any physical contact with human diplomatic personnel requires explicit consent from both the individual and their partner, if applicable." The chamber erupted in a chorus of protests, objections, and what sounded like several species-specific expressions of disbelief. "This is preposterous," sputtered the Rigelian ambassador, his tentacles writhing with indignation. "We cannot conduct meaningful diplomacy under such restrictive parameters." David turned to look at him with the kind of mild interest that predators typically reserved for particularly slow prey. "Would you like a practical demonstration of why we need these restrictions?" David asked conversationally. The Rigelian's tentacles immediately stopped writhing and attempted to hide behind his chair. Furthermore, Rebecca continued, apparently unaware of the byplay. Any violation of these protocols will be considered an act of aggression against the human species as a whole, with responses calibrated appropriately. You cannot dictate terms to the entire Galactic Council, Vexnari protested, though her voice lacked conviction. The precedent alone would— We're not dictating, David interrupted gently. We're negotiating. This is what human negotiation looks like when conducted from a position of mutual respect and understanding. He reached over and gave Klextar's shoulder a friendly pat. The Zephyrian flinched violently and made a sound like a broken air recycling unit attempting to process liquid nitrogen. And if we refuse to agree to these terms? Asked the Corvan delegate, though he was already reaching for his stylus to sign the documents. David's smile remained perfectly pleasant and absolutely terrifying. Then we negotiate from a different position entirely. I'm quite flexible about methodology. The silence that followed was the kind of quiet that usually preceded either unanimous agreement or mass evacuation. In this case, it preceded both. All in favor? Vexnari asked weakly. Every hand, tentacle, pseudopod, and manipulator appendage in the chamber rose immediately. Even Klextar managed a trembling gesture of agreement, though it might have been an involuntary muscle spasm. Excellent, Rebecca said, making neat check marks on her preparation list. Now, about those trade agreements we were discussing yesterday before the unfortunate interruption. What followed was 3 hours of the most productive diplomacy in Galactic Council history. Every proposal Rebecca made was approved unanimously and without modification. Every trade deal was accepted with enthusiastic support. Every human request was granted with the kind of eager cooperation typically reserved for religious experiences or hostage situations. The Agricultural Expansion Treaty, which had been stalled in committee for 18 months, was approved in 12 minutes. The Mining Rights Accord, previously deemed economically unfeasible by 17 different species, was suddenly discovered to be surprisingly reasonable and an excellent opportunity for interspecies cooperation. The Trade Route Optimization Protocol, which would have given human merchant vessels preferential access to the galaxy's most profitable shipping lanes, was not only approved but expanded to include exclusive rights to several previously restricted sectors. David sat quietly through most of the proceedings, occasionally adjusting Klextar's posture when the ambassador started to slide off his chair. His presence was a constant reminder of what happened when diplomatic niceties failed, and the effect on the Assembly's decision-making process was both immediate and comprehensive. The Zephyrian Empire would be honored to offer humanity a most favored trading partner status, Klextar managed to whisper during a brief lull in the proceedings, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone who had recently discovered religion through percussive theology. How generous, Rebecca replied, making another note. We accept, of course. Of course, Klextar agreed, then added in an even smaller voice, Please don't let him touch me again. That depends entirely on your future behavior, David said mildly, causing the ambassador to emit a sound like a deflating balloon filled with existential dread. As the session entered its final hour, Rebecca began wrapping up the remaining agenda items with the systematic efficiency of someone who had just accomplished 6 months of diplomatic work in a single morning. I think that covers everything on our list, she announced, consulting her notes one final time. Unless there are any other concerns or objections. The chamber remained absolutely silent. Several delegates appeared to be holding their breath. Wonderful. Same time next month for our follow-up session. 43 alien heads nodded in perfect unison, creating a brief moment of inadvertent choreography that would later be analyzed by xenobiologists as an example of spontaneous species-wide compliance behavior. As the session officially ended and delegates began filing out with the careful haste of people leaving a building that might explode, David helped Klextar to his feet with the kind of gentle courtesy typically reserved for handling antique glassware. Ambassador, he said softly, his voice carrying just enough warmth to be reassuring and just enough edge to be terrifying. I hope we understand each other now. Klextar managed a weak nod, his compound eyes reflecting the kind of profound understanding that usually came through extended meditation or severe trauma. Excellent. Rebecca is genuinely looking forward to working with your trade delegation. She has some fascinating ideas about integrating Zephyrian agricultural techniques with human farming methods. He gave Klextar's shoulder another friendly pat, and the ambassador's knees immediately buckled. Only David's steadying hand kept him upright. See you next month. As they walked toward the exit, Rebecca slipped her arm through David's with the comfortable familiarity of a couple heading home after a successful dinner party. That went remarkably well, she observed. Better than I expected, honestly, though I think we might have overcorrected slightly. How so? David gestured toward the fleeing delegates, who were practically stampeding for the exits, despite their various species' different locomotion methods. I don't think anyone's going to want to negotiate with us for quite a while. That's perfectly fine. We got everything we wanted anyway, plus several things we hadn't even thought to ask for. Behind them, station medical personnel were helping Ambassador Klextar to the medical bay, the Zephyrian muttering something under his breath in a repetitive cadence that suggested either prayer or psychological conditioning. Never touch the human's mate, he whispered. Never threaten the human's mate. Never even look at the human's mate without explicit permission and proper documentation. The phrase would later become part of standard galactic diplomatic training, right after basic universal translation, and before how to recognize when you've started an interspecies war. In the observation booth above the chamber, Counselor Vexenari stood with her aide, watching the last of the delegates flee through the exits with the kind of dignified panic typically associated with natural disasters. Make a note in the official record, she said quietly. What should I write, Counselor? Vexenari watched David and Rebecca disappear through the exit, walking hand in hand like they were heading home from a pleasant shopping trip instead of a diplomatic session that had fundamentally altered the balance of galactic power. Write this. Today, we learned that humans are not the peaceful, cooperative species we believed them to be. They are something far more dangerous. The aide's stylus hovered over his datapad. Is that the complete statement, Counselor? No. Vexenari turned away from the window, her expression carrying the weight of someone who had just witnessed the end of an era. Add this. They are peaceful and cooperative by choice, not by nature, and we should never, ever forget the difference. She paused at the door, looking back at the empty chamber where the future of galactic diplomacy had just been rewritten by a man in a business suit and his wife with a briefcase. Also, she added quietly, we should never have assumed humans were civilized just because they wear suits and say please. The aide finished his notes and looked up. Should I classify this as an official diplomatic statement or a personal observation, Counselor? Vexenari considered the question for a long moment, thinking about David's pleasant smile and the way he'd carried a 7-foot alien diplomat like luggage. Classify it as a survival guide, she said finally. Something tells me we're going to need it.